The foreclosure notice had been pinned to the refrigerator for 23 days. The edges had started to curl. The ink had faded where morning sunlight hit the paper through the kitchen window. But the words hadn't changed. They still said the same thing they said on day one. 60 days to vacate. 60 days to leave the only home she had ever known. Margaret was 67 years old. She had lived on this land in rural Montana since she was 19, dead, with 48 years of waking up to the same view of the mountains. 48 years of coffee on the same porch. 48 years of watching seasons change over 160 acres that her husband's family had owned for 4 generations. But her husband was gone now. Earl had died 8 months earlier. Heart attack in the south field while checking on the fence line. By the time she found him, his skin was already cold. The grass around him had bent under his weight, forming the shape of a man who would never stand up again. And now they wanted her land. 3 nights later, Margaret woke up at 2 in the morning to a sound she had never heard before. A growl so low and deep it seemed to come from the walls themselves. From the floor, from somewhere underneath her bones. She sat up in bed. The room was dark. The only light came from the moon bleeding through the curtains, painting everything silver and shadow. Dougal standing at her bedroom door, every muscle in its body locked tight, its head low, its eyes fixed on something beyond the hallway, beyond the kitchen, something outside. Margaret's heart began to pound. She pushed the blankets aside and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cold under her bare feet. The house was silent except for that growl, that constant rumble that vibrated through the air like a warning siren set to the lowest possible frequency. She had let the dog inside 3 days ago, fed it, cleaned its wounds as best she could. It had slept on the floor beside her bed every night since, and every night she had felt safer than she had in months. But she had never heard it make this sound. This was different. This was the sound of something preparing for a fight. She crept down the hallway, staying close to the wall. The dog moved with her, positioning itself just ahead, always between her and whatever waited in the darkness. When she reached the kitchen, she saw it headlights, sweeping across the property, moving slow along the fence line that bordered the south field. Then, another set, and another. 3 vehicles, maybe 4. Hard to tell in the dark. They weren't using the driveway. They had come in through the old service road that ran along the back of the property. The road Earl used to take when he needed to check the far pastures. The road nobody should be using at 2 in the morning. Margaret pressed herself against the wall beside the window. Her breath came fast and shallow. The dog's growl had dropped even lower now, almost subsonic, vibrating through the floorboards and into her chest. She watched as the vehicles stopped near the creek. Doors opened. Figures stepped out. She couldn't see faces from this distance, but she could see flashlights. Could see them moving in patterns, sweeping back and forth across the ground. Measuring something, marking something, dens. And then one figure separated from the others and started walking toward the house. The flashlight beam bounced with each step closer, closer, until it stopped about 50 yards from the back porch. The figure raised something to its mouth, a phone, maybe, or a radio. And then a voice carried across the cold night air, clear enough for Margaret to hear every word. "I know you're watching, Margaret Dale Brecker, standing in her field, in the middle of the night, with a crew of men surveying her land like she was already gone." The dog's growl became a snarl, its lips pulled back, its body coiled like a spring ready to release. Margaret's hand found the dog's head, rested there, steadying them both. She didn't turn on the lights, didn't open the door, didn't give him anything. She just watched as Dale stood there for another long moment, flashlight pointed at her windows, waiting for a reaction he wasn't going to get. Finally, he turned and walked back to the others. The vehicles started up again. The headlights swung around, and within minutes, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness at the edge of the property. Margaret stayed at the window for a long time after that. The dog stayed with her, pressed against her leg, its warmth the only thing keeping her grounded. When the sky finally started to lighten, she walked to the living room and sat down in Earl's chair. The leather was cracked and worn. It still smelled like him. Like coffee and sawdust and the soap he used every morning, too. The dog lay down at her feet, Its eyes closed, but its ears stayed alert, swiveling at every sound. Margaret stared at the mantel across the room. At the clock that sat there, silent, hands frozen at 3:47 in the morning. The exact minute the hospital had called to tell her Earl was gone. She hadn't wound it since. Hadn't been able to bring herself to touch it. Time had stopped that night, and part of her had stopped with it. She looked down at her hands, thin, spotted with age, trending, slightly in the early morning light. She thought about what Dale had said that first day. Earl would have signed by now. The words had made her angry then. But now, sitting in this chair, in this house, on this land that felt too big and too empty without her husband, she wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe she was too old for this fight. Too tired. Too alone. She caught her reflection in the dark window. A small woman in a faded nightgown. Grey hair loose around her shoulders. Ties that looked hollowed out by months of grief and sleepless nights. This was what Dale saw when he looked at her. A widow waiting to give up. A woman running out of time. The dog lifted its head and looked at her. Those steady eyes. That scarred face. It had been through something terrible too. Something that had left marks on its body and probably deeper marks on its spirit. But it was still here, still standing, still watching over a stranger's land like it had something left to protect. Marguerite. Margaret thought about the impossible choice in front of her. She could open that door the next time Dale came. Let the dog do what its instincts were screaming to do. There would be blood. There would be consequences. And Dale would have exactly what he needed. Proof of a dangerous animal. Reason to take action, excuse to push her out faster, or she could stay silent. Stay hidden. Let them measure her land in the dark, inch by inch, until they found a way to take it legally. Bet. Let them wait her out. Let them win by simply outlasting her. Neither choice felt like winning. Both felt like different ways of losing. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what Earl would say, what he would do. But the memory wouldn't come. 8 months was long enough for his voice to start fading. For the specific words to blur into feelings. She knew he loved this land, knew he would have fought for it. But she couldn't hear him anymore, couldn't feel him guiding her the way she used to. She was alone. Truly alone, and the weight of that pressed down on her chest like a stone. The dog stood up, walked over to her, rested its massive head on her knee, too. And then Margaret realized the foreclosure was never really about the money. It was never about missed payments or unpaid taxes or any of the reasons printed on those official documents. It was about time. They had been waiting for Earl to die. And now they were waiting for her to die too. Waiting for her to give up. To get tired. To fade away quietly so they could take what they wanted without a fight. The money was just a tool. The foreclosure was just pressure. The real strategy was patience. They thought she would break. Margaret's hand tightened on the arm of the chair. The trembling stopped. She looked at the dog. The dog looked back. Somewhere outside, the sun was rising over the mountains. Light spilling across the fields Earl had walked for 40 years. The fields his father had walked, and his father before that. Margaret stood up. Her knees ached. Her back was stiff, but she stood. She walked to the mantel, picked up the silent clock, felt its weight in her hands. She wasn't going to wind it. Not yet. But she wasn't going to let it gather dust anymore either. She set it back down and turned to face the window. The south field stretched out golden in the early light. Beautiful, stubborn hers. The dog came to stand beside her, shoulder against her leg, eyes on the horizon. They had 37 days. Maybe less. But Margaret was done waiting. The morning was cold. Late October in Montana meant frost on the ground before sunrise and breath you could see hanging in the air. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago. She wasn't really drinking it. She was just holding it. Holding on to something warm because everything else felt so cold. Outside the window, the chickens were already awake. She could hear them scratching at the dirt near the coop. She needed to feed them. That was the routine. That had always been the routine. Earl used to do it, but now it was hers. Everything was hers now. The feeding, the fixing, the worrying, the lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering how much longer she could hold on. She set the coffee down and reached for her coat. It hung on the hook by the back door, right next to Earl's flannel jacket. She hadn't moved his jacket, hadn't washed it. It still held the shape of his shoulders. Sometimes, when the loneliness got too heavy, she pressed her face against it and breathed in. He was still there in the fabric, fading, but there. The back door creaked when she opened it. Earl had always meant to fix that. Now it was just another thing on the list. Another thing that would probably never get done. The chickens gathered around her feet when she scattered the feed. They didn't care about foreclosure notices or dead husbands, or the way the world seemed to be closing in. They just wanted to eat. There was something almost comforting about that. Something simple. She was walking back toward the house when she heard the truck. It wasn't unusual to hear vehicles out here. The road that ran past her property connected a few other farms to the main highway, but this truck was slowing down. This truck was turning into her driveway. Caught. Margaret stopped walking. Her hand tightened around the empty feed bucket. She recognized the truck before she saw the driver. It was a dark blue Ford, maybe 10 years old, with a dent in the front bumper that had been there for as long as she could remember. It belonged to Dale Brecker, the county sheriff. Except Dale wasn't wearing his uniform today. He was dressed in regular clothes, jeans, a brown jacket, work boots, like he was just a neighbor stopping by. Like this was a casual visit. Margaret knew better. Dale had been coming around ever since Earl died. At first it seemed like concern. A lawman checking on a widow who lived alone, miles from anyone who could help if something went wrong. But the visits had started to feel different lately. The questions had started to feel different. How are you managing the property by yourself? Have you thought about what you're going to do? You know, there are people who would pay good money for land like this. Dale climbed out of his truck and walked toward her with that same smile he always wore. The smile that never quite reached his eyes. Margaret didn't smile back. He was in his early 50s, broad in the shoulders, with a face that had probably been handsome once, but had gone soft around the edges. He walked like a man who was used to people moving out of his way. Like a man who expected to get what he wanted. He stopped a few feet from her and put his hands in his pockets. Casual, friendly, but his eyes kept drifting, past her shoulder to the barn. To the fields beyond. To the creek that ran along the western edge of the property. Water rights in Montana were worth almost as much as the land itself. "Morning," he said. Margaret nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak yet. The anger was already building in her chest, and she had learned a long time ago that anger made her say things she could untake back. "Just wanted to check in," Dale continued. "See how you're holding up? I'm holding up fine. That's good. That's real good. See." He rocked back on his heels, still looking around. "Place looks quiet. Peaceful it is." Silence stretched between them. The kind of silence that had weight to it. The kind that was waiting for something. Dale cleared his throat. "Listen, I know this isn't easy. Losing Earl, dealing with all this on your own. I know the bank's been giving you trouble." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I'm handling it. I'm sure you are. But you know, there are options. Good options." He paused, and his smile widened just a little. "I've got some friends who work in development. Real estate folks, they've been looking at properties out this way. Good people, fair people. They'd give you a price that would set you up nice, somewhere warm. Somewhere you wouldn't have to work so hard." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. There it was. The real reason for the visits. The real reason for the concern. "I'm not selling." Dale's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. The shade that stepped out of the shadows was massive. White fur matted with dried blood and mud. Ribs pressing against skin like the bars of a cage. One ear torn halfway off, the wound crusted and dark. Eyes that held no fear. Only a kind of tired awareness. The look of something that had been fighting to survive for a very long time. It was a dog. A Great Pyrenees. The kind of breed farmers used to guard livestock from wolves and coyotes. But this one wasn't guarding anything. This one looked like it had been through a war and somehow walked out the other side. Margaret stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The dog was easily 130 pounds, maybe more before whatever happened to it. Its white coat was stained yellow and brown in patches. Its legs trembled slightly, like standing was taking everything it had. But it didn't run, didn't growl, didn't show its teeth. It just looked at her. Behind Margaret, Dale's voice cut through the silence. Sharp, urgent, don't move. She heard him reaching for his phone, heard him muttering something about animal control, about a dangerous stray, about liability and safety, and all the words that sounded reasonable but felt wrong. The dog's eyes shifted, just for a second, from Margaret to the man behind her. And something changed in its posture. The trembling stopped. Its body went rigid. Its lips pulled back just enough to show the tips of teeth that were still white despite everything else. It wasn't looking at Dale like he was a threat. It was looking at him like it was deciding something. Margaret felt her legs moving before her mind gave permission. One step, then another, pitting herself directly between the dog and the sheriff. Her back to the animal, her face to Dale. His hand was on his phone now, his thumb hovering over the screen. His eyes wide with something between confusion and anger. "What are you doing?" Margaret didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that something inside her had shifted. Something that had been asleep for 8 months was suddenly awake. The part of her that used to stand next to Earl when trouble came. The part that had slowly been fading since the morning she found him in the south field. "It's just a stray," Dale said. His voice was tight now. Controlled. Probably been living out here for weeks. Could have rabies. Could have anything. It doesn't have rabies. You don't know that. I know it hasn't touched my chickens, too. The words came out before she fully understood why. But as soon as she said them, she knew they were true. She had been losing eggs lately, finding shells cracked and empty. She had blamed foxes, blamed raccoons, but her chickens were still alive. Every single one of them. A dog this size, this hungry, could have wiped out the whole flock in one night. But it hadn't. Dale's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged. He especially didn't like being challenged by a 67-year-old woman standing in front of a half-dead dog. "Move, or I move you." The words hit the air like a slap. Cold hard, the voice of a man who was used to getting his way. Margaret felt her spine straighten, felt something hot rise in her chest. Fear and anger mixing together into something she didn't quite recognize. "This is my property," she said. "You're not in uniform. You don't have a warrant. That phone call can wait until I decide what to do with an animal on my own land." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind pushing through the dry grass and the distant call of a crow somewhere over the fields. Then Dale lowered his phone. Slowly, his smile came back. But it was different now, thinner, sharper. "Have it your way," he said. "But when that thing bites someone, when it goes after a neighbor's kid or tears up someone's cattle, don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked back to his truck. The door slammed. The engine started. Gravel sprayed as he pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the road. Margaret didn't move until the sound of the truck faded completely. Until the silence settled back over the property like a blanket. Then she turned around. The dog was sitting now. Not lying down, not standing, just sitting. Like it was waiting. Its eyes were fixed on her face, with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She took a step toward it. The dog didn't move. Another step, still nothing. She was close enough now to see the damage clearly. The torn ear was at least a week old, maybe 2. There were scratches along its muzzle. Some healed, some fresh. Its paws were cracked and raw, like it had walked a very long way on very hard ground. But underneath all that, underneath the blood and the dirt and the exhaustion, there was something else. Something steady, something unbroken. Margaret crouched down slowly. Her knees ached in protest. She held out her hand, palm up, fingers loose. The dog leaned forward and sniffed. Its nose was cold and dry against her skin. Then, so gently, she almost didn't feel it. It pressed its head into her palm. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned. "Where did you come from?" she whispered. The dog didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But something passed between them anyway. Some kind of understanding that didn't need words. She stood up slowly and walked toward the hay shed. The dog followed, keeping pace beside her, its shoulder brushing against her leg. The shed smelled like dust and old straw and something else. Something animal. The dog had been living here for a while. She could see the nest it had made in the corner. A hollow scraped into the dirt and lined with whatever soft material it could find. An old burlap sack. Some dried leaves. The remains of a feed bag that had blown in from somewhere. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the other things. The things that didn't belong. Chicken bones, piled neatly near the entrance. Not her chickens. These were scrapped, the kind that came from a grocery store rotisserie. Someone had been feeding this dog. Boot prints in the dust, heavy treads, work boots, but not her boots. Not Earl's boots. Instead, she stood in the doorway of the old hay shed, looking out at her land. The fields Earl had worked. The fence lines he had walked. The mountains that had watched over 4 generations of his family. And she wondered, for the first time since he died, if maybe she wasn't supposed to give up after all. The dog pressed against her leg, warm and solid and real, and in the distance, she could still see the dust from Dale's truck hanging in the air. He would be back. She knew that now. This wasn't over. But when he came back, he wouldn't find her alone. The county recorder's office opened at 8 in the morning. Margaret was waiting at the door at 7:45. She had driven 30 miles in Earl's old pickup truck, the one that still had his sunglasses in the visor and his work gloves stuffed behind the seat. The engine knocked a little when it idled, but it ran. That was enough. The dog had watched her leave from the porch. She had told it to stay, guard the house. And somehow, impossibly, it had understood. It sat there like a statue carved from stone, eyes fixed on the road until her truck disappeared over the hill. Now she stood on the concrete steps of the county building, a folder tucked under her arm, her heart beating steady for the first time in weeks. The woman at the front desk was young, maybe 20. She looked up from her computer with the tired expression of someone who had answered the same questions 1,000 times. Margaret smiled at her, a real smile. The kind she used to give customers at the feed store back when she and Earl ran it together. "I need to look at some property records," she said, and some business filings. Anything connected to development projects in the county over the last 2 years. The woman blinked. "That's a lot of records. I've got time." It took 3 hours. 3 hours of flipping through files and scrolling through databases and asking questions that made the clerk increasingly nervous. But by 11 o'clock, Margaret had what she needed. Development company that wanted her land was called Horizon Valley LLC. On paper, it looked legitimate. Nice website. Professional letterhead. But the ownership records told a different story. The company had been formed 18 months ago, right around the time Earl first started feeling sick. Right around the time he went to the doctor complaining of chest pains that turned out to be nothing, until they turned out to be everything. And the registered agent for Horizon Valley LLC was a man named Robert Brecker, Dale's cousin. Margaret sat back in her chair and stared at the document. The connection was right there in black and white. The sheriff who had been pressuring her to sell. The company that wanted to buy. Family. She kept digging. Property tax records showed that Horizon Valley had already purchased 3 other farms in the county, all of them owned by elderly widows or widowers. All of them sold within a year of losing a spouse. All of them bought for prices well below market value. Margaret's hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from something else. Something that felt like fire catching in dry wood. She photographed everything, every document, every signature, every date that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. Then she drove to the newspaper office. The Gazette was a small operation. 2 reporters, 1 editor, and a printing press that had been running since 1952. But it was the only paper in the county, and people read it. People trusted it. The editor was a man in his 60s named Wallace. He had known Earl for 30 years. Had written his obituary when he died. Margaret laid the photographs on his desk. Told him everything. The visits from Dale. The night surveying, the cigarette butts in her hay shed. The pattern of purchases targeting grieving families. Wallace listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up one of the photographs and studied it for a long moment. "You know what you're doing here," he said, accusing a sitting sheriff of corruption. "That's not a small thing, I know. He's got friends, powerful friends. This could get ugly. It's already ugly. He just thinks I can't see it." Wallace set the photograph down and looked at her. really looked at her. He was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. Earl would be proud of you, he said quietly. Margaret's throat tightened. She didn't trust herself to speak. Give me 2 days, Wallace continued. Let me verify what I can. If this holds up, we run it front page. She nodded, shook his hand, walked out into the afternoon sun. Drive home felt different. The mountains looked sharper, the sky looked bluer. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for 8 months had shifted somehow. It wasn't gone. But it wasn't crushing her anymore either. When she pulled into the driveway, the dog was still on the porch, exactly where she had left it. But as soon as it saw the truck, it stood up. Its tail moved, just once. Just a small wag that said everything words couldn't. She got out and walked toward the house. The dog met her halfway, pressing its head against her hand. I gave you a name, she said, while I was driving. Hope that's okay. The dog looked up at her, Sentinel, because that's what you've been doing. Keeping guard. The dog's tail wagged again. Stronger this time. Margaret scratched behind its good ear. The torn one had started to heal. New pink skin growing over the wound. Scars forming where there used to be open flesh. They were both healing. Slowly, together. That night, she fed Sentinel from Earl's old bowl thing. The one that used to belong to a border collie they had years ago. The one that had been sitting empty in the pantry ever since. She watched Sentinel eat. Careful bites, no rushing. Like an animal that had learned not to trust abundance. We're the same, you know, she said. Both of us lost something. Sentinel finished eating and looked up at her, patient, listening. I don't know what happens next, but I know I'm not running. Not anymore. The dog walked to the back door and sat down, facing the fields on guard. Like always, Margaret smiled. For the first time in 8 months, it didn't hurt. The next 2 days passed slowly. She worked around the property. Cleaned out the hay shed and put down fresh straw for Sentinel. Margaret stepped onto the porch. Sentinel stood beside her, 130 pounds of muscle and scar tissue and absolute stillness. He stepped out in full uniform this time, badge gleaming, gun on his hip. Behind him came 2 men in suits, the assessors, probably lawyers maybe. But behind them came something Dale hadn't expected. Wallace from the Gazette. A young reporter with a camera. And a woman holding a microphone with a TV station logo on the side. Dale stopped walking. His face went through about 6 different expressions in 3 seconds. Confusion, anger, something that might have been fear. Margaret held up the folder. The one with all the photographs, all the documents, all the proof. Morning. Dale, she said. Her voice was steady, clear. The voice of a woman who had stopped waiting to be saved. Its presence was enough. A guardian standing in the light. A protector who had come from nowhere and stayed when it mattered most. The cameras started rolling. The reporter raised her microphone. Margaret walked off the porch, folder in hand, Sentinel at her side, heading straight toward the man who thought he could take everything from her. Dale's hand twitched toward his radio, then stopped, because there was nowhere to run, nothing to say. No one left to pressure. Froze for the season had come overnight. The ground was hard under Margaret's boots. Nothing getting dug up now, nothing getting taken. She stopped 3 feet from Dale and held out the folder. I think you know what's in here, she said. And somewhere behind her, Sentinel stood on the porch like a statue, watching, waiting, ready. The foreclosure notice was gone from the refrigerator. In its place hung a newspaper clipping, edges straight, corners crisp. The headline read, "County Sheriff Resigns Amid Corruption Investigation." Below it, a photograph showed Dale Brecker walking out of the county building. Hand raised to block the camera, face twisted into something between shame and fury. Margaret didn't look at the clipping much anymore. She didn't need to. The words had done their job. The story had spread from the local paper to the regional news, to stations 3 states away. A widow, a corrupt sheriff, a scheme to steal land from grieving families. It was the kind of story people remembered. Dale hadn't gone to prison. The evidence wasn't quite enough for criminal charges. But it was enough for everything else. Enough for him to lose his badge. Enough for his cousin's company to dissolve overnight. Enough for the other families to come forward with their own stories, their own suspicions, their own relief that someone had finally spoken up. The bank had quietly dropped the foreclosure proceedings 2 weeks after the story broke. No apology, no explanation. Just a letter stating that the matter had been resolved and no further action would be taken. Margaret had framed that letter to it hung in the hallway next to the family photographs. Next to Earl's parents on their wedding day. Next to her and Earl cutting the cake at their own reception, both of them so young it almost hurt to look at. Spring had come early this year. The snow melted fast, and the fields turned green almost overnight. Wildflowers pushed up through the soil in patches of yellow and purple and white. The creek ran high with snow, clear and cold, and loud enough to hear from the porch. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand. This time the coffee was hot. This time she actually drank it. Outside, Sentinel was making his morning rounds. He did this every day now. A slow walk along the fence line, checking the corners, sniffing the posts, making sure everything was where it belonged. His white coat had grown back thick and clean. The mud and blood were long gone. He had filled out too. The ribs no longer showed. His legs no longer trembled. He moved with a kind of easy confidence now, the walk of an animal that knew exactly where it was and exactly why it was there. Margaret watched him pause near the south field, the place where Earl had fallen. The grass had grown over that spot long ago. There was no mark, no indication that anything had happened there. But Sentinel always paused in that exact place, every single morning. Like he knew. Maybe he did. Animals understood things people couldn't explain. Margaret had stopped trying to explain it. She finished her coffee and rinsed the cup in the sink. The water was warm. The pipes had finally stopped freezing, now that she had wrapped them the way Earl always meant to. Another thing off the list. Another small victory. The back door didn't creak anymore either. She had fixed that herself, watched a video on the internet, bought the supplies at the hardware store, spent an afternoon with a screwdriver and a can of oil. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Earl would have laughed at her technique, would have shown her a better way, but he would have been proud too. She knew that, like she knew the sun would rise. She stepped onto the porch and breathed in the morning air, cool and clean and full of the smell of growing things. Sentinel saw her and changed direction, trotting across the field to meet her. His tail wagged as he approached. Not the small, cautious wag of those first days. A full wag now. The wag of a dog that had found its place. He climbed the porch steps and sat down beside her, pressing his shoulder against her leg. Warm and solid and real. Margaret rested her hand on his head. The fur was soft under her fingers. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. 1 year, she said quietly. 1 year since you showed up in that shed. Sentinel looked up at her. His eyes were calm content. The haunted look was gone, replaced by something that might have been peace, too. I don't know where you came from, she continued. Don't know what happened to you before, but I'm glad you're here. The dog leaned into her hand. A small sound escaped his throat. Not a whine, not a bark, just a sound of acknowledgement, of agreement. They stood there together for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. The same mountains Elle's family had watched for 4 generations. The same view that had greeted her every morning for 48 years. But it looked different now. Not because anything had changed out there, because something had changed in here. In her chest, in the place where grief had lived for so long. Tea. The grief was still there. Would probably always be there, but it had made room for other things. For hope, for purpose. For the simple satisfaction of still being here when everyone expected her to be gone. She thought about Dale sometimes. Wondered where he was, what he was doing. Probably selling insurance in some other county. Probably telling himself he had done nothing wrong. People like that always found ways to justify themselves. But he wasn't her problem anymore. He had taken his shot and missed, and she was still standing. The screen door behind her creaked. She made a mental note to fix that one too. Inside, the mantel clock was ticking. She had wound it that morning, the same way she wound it every morning now. The hands showed 7:15. Time moving forward. Time she was choosing to spend instead of letting it drain away. She walked back inside, Sentinel following close behind. His nails clicked on the kitchen floor. Another sound she had gotten used to. Another small piece of a life that had rebuilt itself around an absence. Earl's flannel jacket still hung by the door. She hadn't moved it, but she had started hanging her own jacket next to it. Side by side, the way they used to stand. The refrigerator hummed. The coffee maker gurgled. The clock ticked. Normal sounds. Ordinary morning. The kind of moment that used to feel empty and now felt full. Margaret opened the back door and stepped onto the porch again. Dirt. The chickens were awake, scratching at the dirt near the coop. She needed to feed them. That was the routine. That had always been the routine, but today she didn't feel the weight of it. Today it just felt like living. Sentinel walked beside her across the yard. His shadow stretched long in the early light, merged with hers on the grass. Two shapes moving together, two survivors who had found each other at the exact moment they needed to. She scattered the feed and watched the chickens gather. Simple creatures with simple needs. There was comfort in that. There always had been. When she turned back toward the house, she paused, looked at the property spread out around her. The barn with its fresh coat of paint. The fence line standing straight and strong, too. The hay shed where a wounded dog had made its stand. Her land, her home, her life still here, still hers. Sentinel sat beside her, his scarred head lifted to catch the morning breeze. His eyes scanned the horizon the way they always did. Watchful, ready, but relaxed too. Like he finally believed the danger had passed. Margaret reached down and scratched behind his good ear. "We stay," she said, too. The words were quiet, simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had fought for. Everything she had almost lost. Everything she had chosen to hold on to when the world told her to let go. Sentinel's tail wagged once, slow and sure. The mountains stood silent in the distance. The creek sang its endless song. The wind moved through the grass like a hand running through hair. And Margaret Holloway, 68 years old, stood on her porch with her dog at her side, watching the sun rise over the land her family had worked for generations. The land that would stay in her family for as long as she had breath to fight for it. The mantel clock ticked in the empty kitchen. 3:48, 3:49, 3:50. Time moving again. Finally moving again.